Hello, and welcome to my attempt to get through a major study on the book of Romans. So, to undertake all of this, the first the first couple of words says Paul. Paul is servant of God, and so then in order to get to the beginning of Romans, we have to research Paul. And that's my whole thing with doing this whole series on the Bible. There's a lot of work involved in studying and learning about the scriptures because you want to start in Romans, but in order to start in Romans, you have to start with the author, Paul. Now, who was Paul? Well, Paul was standing there watching everybody's clothing or everybody's cloaks. Why? Because they had to take off their cloaks because they were picking up some dirty rocks and they were throwing them at Stephen. And you're like, well, now we got Paul. Now we got to go back to who was Stephen the martyr. And then going from there, we find out that Paul or Saul was then, right after that, headed out to persecute the church and persecute Christians and throw them in jail and get papers to have them thrown in jail for worshiping or following this Jesus. So in there, odd thing happens. He's on his way to persecute the church, and Jesus himself blinds him with his great light, knocks him off of his horse, and takes this person who was breathing out threats and persecuting the church and says, "You're my servant now, and you'll do what I want," basically, and blinded him for 3 days. Here he is, blind, and he has to go find this guy named, was it Ananias? In a vision, he sees it in his dream because he can't see with his eyes, that this guy's going to come and lead him. So he had to be led to where he met Ananias, and then his eyes were opened, and then he became a follower and the biggest advocate for Christ. So how does this pertain to the book of Romans? Well, this is how it pertains. Seeing that Paul, or Saul, because he was renamed Paul later, was coming to the church to preach to the church. The church, and we're talking about the people who followed Jesus, who were Jews who were being persecuted, they're looking at this person who was throwing them in jail and going, can we trust this guy? How could it be that God could save this very guy who hated Jesus and who's killing us? And here's my point about this and where I'm going with this. Because you see, Paul would have related very, very, very heavily to another character who was chosen, who would have been an unlikely person, who was not a Jew, to help the Jewish people or to help the chosen people at the time. And his name was Cyrus. And this is where the connection between Paul and Cyrus actually is shown, or I believe begins. You see, Cyrus was also chosen to build the temple of God and to be blessed by God. And Cyrus did the work of God, building the temple and and restoring Jerusalem. But he was not a Jew. He was an unlikely person to be chosen by God. But it's very, very important to understand that when these arguments came up about Why did God do this? Why did God choose Paul? And why did God choose Cyrus to do his work? And God says, "Who are you to command me regarding my children and the work of my hands?" And this is where we start the book of Romans.